Kyle woke up. He is famous. Kyle decided to take some time to choose the perfect outfit, knowing how important appearance is. Kyle miraculously crammed his dumpy body into the suit. The chest pockets were filled with random knickknacks. Kyle wrote down his first question. Kyle wrote down his second question. Kyle wrote down his last. Kyle ripped his page of notes out of the notebook and got up from the desk. Kyle opened the fridge, intending to find something to eat. Kyle constructed a breakfast of poached eggs and toast, along with a small fruit cup and grilled sausage. Kyle ate his breakfast slowly and thoughtfully, enjoying every bite. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. "And I as well, Rachel," answered Kyle, extending his hand in greeting. "You are a most welcome guest." After other mild exchanges of pleasantries, Kyle and Rachel were prompted to take their places for the broadcast. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction. However," said Kyle, suddenly dropping his voice, "Rachel May is not sitting next to me. She is not new to this show. She did not walk in before me. In fact," said Kyle, "I am Rachel May." Rachel looked at Kyle, confused, and silently mouthed the words, "You are who?" Kyle stood up quickly and threw his arm high above him, pointing upwards. "I have never been Kyle," he proclaimed. "I have never been the host of the show Stay Up Late with Kyle." Kyle looked and pointed directly at the camera. "I am here for but one reason, to interview myself." Kyle sat down in his chair and went to produce the notes he had taken earlier. Kyle read the first question on his list. "Are you a mother?" "Well," he said, brightening, "I'm glad you asked. Yes, I have produced many, many, many children." "In fact," said Kyle, motioning to Rachel, "one of my children is sitting here with me today." Rachel looked incredibly confused. After a moment, Kyle spoke again. "I am your mother!" He stood up again. "Give me a big hug, daughter!" After a moment more, Rachel shrugged, stood up, and gave Kyle a hug. The interview continued, Kyle talking about his supposed raising of Rachel and their times together. Rachel engaged in the interview with exuberance, answering questions as best she could and enjoying every moment. From this episode, Rachel's childhood and family became a debated topic in her fan base. When fans asked Rachel about the matter, she would giggle and make a joke about the interview. Scientists and fans began to dig deep, finding evidence both for and against the Kyle is Rachel's mother theory. But no matter how much anyone dug, nobody was able to come to a conclusion on the matter. Kyle had created a public mystery. Kyle miraculously... Kyle wrote down his second... Kyle ripped his page of notes. Kyle opened the fridge. Kyle constructed a breakfast of poached eggs and toast, along with a small fruit cup and grilled sausage. Kyle ate his breakfast slowly and thoughtfully, enjoying every bite. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. "And I as well, Rachel," answered Kyle, extending his hand in greeting. "You are a most welcome guest." After other mild exchanges of pleasantries, Kyle and Rachel were prompted to take their places for the broadcast. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction." "However," said Kyle, suddenly dropping his voice, "Rachel May is not sitting next to me. She is not new to this show. She did not walk in before me. In fact," said Kyle, "I am Rachel May." Rachel looked at Kyle, confused, and silently mouthed the words, "You are who?" Kyle stood up quickly and threw his arm high above him, pointing upwards. "I have never been Kyle," he proclaimed. "I have never been the host of the show Stay Up Late with Kyle." Kyle looked and pointed directly at the camera. "I am here for but one reason, to interview myself." Kyle sat down in his chair and went to produce the notes he had taken earlier. Kyle read the first question on his list. "Are you a mother?" I'm glad you asked," said Kyle. "Yes, I am." Or, yes, you are," said Kyle, trying to figure out who was talking to whom. Or, "I am..." In a fit, Kyle continued to re-answer his question, trying to come up with the correct phrasing. Rachel spoke up. "Kyle, I'm not a mother at all, so it doesn't really matter." "Lies! Impossible! I don't believe it!" Kyle banged his fist on the chair. "Kyle, I've never been in a position for that. I've really just focused on my career. All you need to do is ask." Rachel smiled sweetly. Kyle was silent for a moment. Then, realizing he had no idea what he was doing, he decided to let Rachel talk. "So what about your career? Do you enjoy what you do? How'd you get into it?" The two continued talking for the better part of an hour, Kyle asking questions and Rachel answering accordingly. Eventually, Kyle's producer signaled to Kyle that it was time to stop. The broadcast ended. The crew, Rachel and Kyle, said their goodbyes and returned home. But Kyle continued to think about Rachel after the interview ended. Something about Rachel had struck Kyle. He wasn't exactly sure what. But he did know that he was interested to hear that she was single. Kyle wrote down his third question. Kyle wrote down. Kyle ripped. Kyle ate his breakfast. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. "And I as well, Rachel," answered Kyle, extending his hand in greeting. After other mild exchanges of pleasantries, Kyle and Rachel were prompted to take their places for the broadcast. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction." "However," said Kyle, suddenly dropping his voice, "Rachel May is not sitting next to me. She is not new to this show. She did not walk in before me. In fact," said Kyle, "I am Rachel May." Rachel looked at Kyle, confused, and silently mouthed the words, "You are who?" Kyle stood up quickly and threw his arm high above him, pointing upwards. "I have never been Kyle," he proclaimed. "I have never been the host of the show Stay Up Late with Kyle." Kyle looked and pointed directly at the camera. "I am here for but one reason, to interview myself." Kyle sat down in his chair and went to produce the notes he had taken earlier. Kyle read the first question on his list. "Is your mother a mother?" Kyle replied, "No, because I am my mother." "And," continued Kyle, "I am your mother and everyone's mother and also Rachel and Kyle and... I'm also your children and that woman you met in the coffee shop yesterday and your high school best friend. And I'm your friends and I'm that person next to you and I'm also you!" Kyle waved his arms around and smiled. Nobody seemed to understand. "It's a magic trick!" shouted Kyle happily. "I'm everyone now!" Kyle got up and happily danced out of the studio, arms spread wide. Although not taken seriously at first, sociologists quickly found that Kyle's claims were true. Somehow, magically, Kyle became everyone and nobody else technically existed anymore. After a massive amount of study, it was found that Kyle had stumbled upon a very unexpected sociological loophole. Nobody really knew what to do with this newfound discovery, so they decided to do nothing. Kyle continued to be theoretically everyone, and everybody else continued to be theoretically non-existent. It was a strange time to be alive. Kyle Mirac. Kyle. Kyle constructed a Kyle ate his breakfast slowly and thoughtfully. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. "And I as well, Rachel," answered Kyle, extending his hand in greeting. "You are a most welcome guest." After other mild exchanges of pleasantries, Kyle and Rachel were prompted to take their places for the broadcast. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction." As Rachel started to reply, Kyle clamped his hand over her mouth. "Hush," he said. "I need to do something before we can continue." Kyle removed the CD he had brought to the interview and placed it in a nearby player deck. The sound system kicked into action, piping Kyle's music throughout the studio. Rachel briefly listened, a blank expression on her face. Smiling, Kyle closed his eyes and enjoyed the music for a moment. Then, he spoke. All right, now everything's ready. Let's begin. Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier. Rachel, you managed to keep such a thin and healthy figure, said Kyle. What is your best diet tip? I'm sorry, Kyle, said Rachel. What on earth is this music? It's very... well, it's something. It's an old favorite, Rachel, said Kyle. This is what I grew up on. It's part of my most special collection. Kyle and Rachel sat silently, the music playing in the background. Rachel began to frown. Suddenly, the wall next to Kyle exploded. Through the hole stepped several men in dazzling, flamboyant costumes of bright color. They held guitars, pianos, and other instruments.
Kyle,
said the man in front.
We are the band of your childhood.
Kyle's jaw dropped, smiling. He put his hands to his cheeks. His eyes sparkled.
We have come to issue a grievance about playing our music on TV without a license.
The man took his guitar in both hands and began slamming Kyle's face repeatedly. After several hours, the grievance had been sufficiently repaid. The band left through the hole they had created in the wall. Kyle lay on the floor, thinking about what had happened. Rachel slowly slid to his side. Are you feeling okay, Kyle? She asked. She had a concerned expression on her face. Have you ever met your childhood idol, Rachel? Asked Kyle. The person you looked up to for as long as you can remember. I can't say I have, said Rachel. Kyle raised both fists into the air.
It feels amazing!
Kyle spent the rest of Rachel's interview chatting happily about meeting his lifelong favorite band. Rachel listened and asked questions politely, seeming unfazed that her moment on TV had been uprooted. Eventually, the studio was out of time and the broadcast shut off. Kyle and Rachel walked out of the studio together. Kyle was grinning widely. The two said their goodbyes and walked off in separate directions. As Kyle walked home, he felt like the interview had been everything he had hoped it to be. Kyle had gotten everything he had ever wanted as a child. Kyle woke up. He is famous. Kyle grabbed the flash. Kyle scooped up the chain. Kyle counted out $1.98 in pennies and nickels and traded them for a small packet of batteries. Kyle crammed the batteries into his flashlight. Quickly, before the attendant could acknowledge him, Kyle grabbed Techno Jim by the shoulders. Finding that Techno Jim's cardboard feet were bolted to the ground, Kyle started to heave upwards. After several tugs, Techno Jim broke free, leaving one foot and one leg behind. Kyle glanced at the attendant, who was staring, bewildered, and ran outside. Kyle shined his flashlight into his moist, cave-like closet that had not seen light in years. After several minutes of searching around with the light, Kyle saw something unusual in the back. There was a pile of strange items, including a small metal box with a large red button stamped with Travel Time. Kyle pulled out the electronics from Techno Jim's eyes and fingers and started shoving them into the box. The box began to rattle, imbued with the power of the important technology found on Techno Jim. Suddenly, with a pop and a fizz, Kyle found himself taken back to 19th century Europe. Kyle was riding inside of a horse-drawn carriage. He was surrounded by poofy dresses and shocked faces. Every face was stone cold, made of copper, and definitely a robot. Kyle had found himself in Robo-Europe. The gathered robo-denizens' heads started spinning and shooting out alarm lasers from their mouths and ears. Kyle reacted quickly. Kyle quickly started to consume all of the lasers. Every laser he swallowed gave him more power. Soon, Kyle bloated up and just kinda fart exploded, lasers all over the place. The force of the explosion pushed all beings, metal and not, out of the carriage with great velocity. Kyle landed on a nearby rock face first and immediately lost consciousness. While Kyle was asleep, the robot citizens plugged his body into a generator linked to their main power grid. Having energy sucked from his body kept Kyle in a pseudo-cryogenic state, keeping him unconscious and preserved. Robo-scientists began to use Kyle's energy production as a center of study, launching the robot world into a golden age. Kyle started to power all of the technological advancements of the robot world. Wars began to center around control of Kyle. Kyle was deemed as the most important discovery of the modern robo world. After humans took over the ancient robot civilizations, Kyle was mummified by the ancient Egyptians. Kyle was stolen from a museum in the early 1800s. He was almost smuggled across the Atlantic in an old fishing ship, but sank. Scientists uncovered him encased in ice in the Antarctic and shipped him by helicopter for study. On the way, Kyle was accidentally shoved out of the helicopter. He crash-landed through the roof onto the bed in his apartment. After several days of lying unconscious in bed, Kyle began to stir. Kyle decided to stay put and wither away. Kyle is now a ghost. This does not relieve him of his responsibilities. Kyle felt a sudden pull on his heart. Had he abandoned his job as a ghost? Was he fulfilling his spooky, ethereal role that he'd accepted while lying in bed this morning? Kyle realized he had no other choice. He must spend his day spooking about. Kyle decided he should make a plan about who or where he should spook. Kyle believed that Gabby would be delighted to have him spook about a bit. Kyle started to slowly creep to Gabby's door in a very spooky way. He crouched by Gabby's door, cooing quietly and waiting for her to leave so he could cause her a spook. It didn't take long. Soon, Gabby exited her apartment and started walking towards her car. Kyle crept behind her, invisible to all senses. Gabby opened the driver's side door and got in. She seemed to be leaving for some errands. Kyle was struck with a wonderful idea. Kyle started to run to the back of Gabby's car. Perhaps if he could catch her before she left, he could hide in the trunk. Kyle could make noises as she drove. He could follow her around on her errand, knocking over small objects nearby. Gabby put the car in reverse and floored the accelerator. Invisible to all senses, Kyle was crushed underneath the back tires of the car, creating a large boom. Gabby figured she'd hit the curb. She put the car into forward and floored the accelerator again. Kyle became locked in an endless loop of Gabby trying to move her car out of her parking space, being run over repeatedly. As the day started to wane and it drew closer to the time of Rachel's interview, Kyle ceased to be a ghost. Gabby neither noticed nor stopped. Kyle was forced to conduct Rachel's interview while being run over. Kyle's crew moved the filming set next to Gabby's apartment. Rachel appeared. Kyle asked her many questions. They shared several laughs. The interview was successful. The sound of Gabby flooring her car's accelerator drowned out large sections of the episode. Kyle decided to stay put. Kyle is now a ghost. Kyle felt a sudden pull on his heart. Had he abandoned his job as a ghost? Was he fulfilling his spooky, ethereal role that he'd accepted while lying in bed this morning? Kyle realized he had no other choice. He must spend his day spooking about. Kyle decided he should make a plan about who or where he should spook. Kyle could think of nobody better to spook than himself. Kyle sat on the sidewalk and looked at the ground. He took a deep breath. Kyle began to scream uncontrollably, as he had managed to spook himself by his very existence. Kyle jumped up from the sidewalk and began to run around, flailing his arms. Unfortunately, Kyle was unable to escape from the fact that he was himself. Kyle spent several minutes screaming. But as he screamed, Kyle realized it was becoming time for Rachel's interview. Continuing to scream, Kyle traveled to his studio. That evening, Kyle tried to do well by his duties and conduct the interview with Rachel. But being able to only express pure terror, the episode consisted only of Rachel watching him scream. The episode was very popular. Kyle was asked to continue screaming in the next episode, and the next. Kyle's show was rebranded to Kyle is Scared with Kyle. The studio went on to produce many episodes. Kyle remained existentially terrified of himself. Kyle decided to stay put and wither away. Kyle is now a ghost. Kyle walked over to the strange. Kyle used his ghostly powers to walk straight through the door. Expecting a battle, Kyle grabbed the laser claymore. Kyle knelt down and inspected the old, rusty container that had been in his closet for ages. It was locked, but had a blade-shaped slot in the top. Kyle took the laser claymore in his hand and slid it into the hole on top of the box. The box began to rumble slowly, but then it shook harder and harder. Suddenly, with a snap, the box lid came loose. Kyle, giddy with excitement, grabbed the box to drag it into the light. With much sweating and pulling, Kyle slowly inched the box out of his closet. He began to giggle and drool. Soon, the box had been transported into the middle of the room. Kyle clapped his hands together and gripped the lid on either side. With a tug, it tumbled to the floor, revealing the contents of the box. There was nothing inside. Kyle was incredibly disappointed. This had been an opportunity for him, a way to find something new, a way to break up the routine. Suddenly, Kyle was struck with an unquenchable feeling of boredom about his life. Kyle jumped to his feet and burst outside, hungry to find anything that could give his day a feeling of interest. Painfully, Kyle started grabbing anything he could reach, smashing it into his face to see what it could possibly do for him. Rocks, benches, people, squirrels, and the ground itself fell into Kyle's grasp, but soon his energy began to wane. Slowly, sadly, Kyle made his way back to his apartment, quietly grabbing small items off the ground and rubbing them against himself. Kyle slowly sank into his bed, as bored as when he had left earlier that day. He looked at the ceiling, feeling hollow. The day had been very hard. As he slowly fell asleep, Kyle wondered what he could possibly do tomorrow to inspire a new sense of interest in his life. He didn't know it then, but tomorrow, Kyle would try something new. Kyle woke up, he is famous. Kyle thought very carefully about the first move of his day. Kyle laid in bed for a moment, thinking about the day ahead. He would produce another episode of his long-running show, yes. Kyle thought about making breakfast, the same breakfast he'd been making for the past 9 years. Kyle thought about the clothes he would wear. They had not changed for a long time. Kyle waited for something new and interesting to enter his head. Something fresh. Kyle continued to wait. Nothing came to mind. In a sudden moment of inspiration, Kyle threw his covers to the ground and stepped out of bed. Kyle had made a decision. Today would not be part of an old journey. Today would be the start of something new. Kyle walked over to his desk and opened the middle drawer. He slowly removed an ancient, withered stick of meat. Today, Kyle planned to make good on his childhood passion, the career he had abandoned to become a talk show host. Kyle looked caringly at the crusty hot dog in his hands. Then, he smiled. Then he bent his lips downwards and slowly sucked the hot dog into his mouth and down into his stomach. Kyle had become a hot dog vendor. He must now prepare for his first day running a hot dog stand. Kyle put on his hot dog suit, which he had made by stitching hot dogs together when he was a child. Feeling fairly hungry, Kyle bent over and took a large bite out of his suit. He felt refreshed. It wasn't enough. Kyle continued to eat his clothing. Soon, Kyle had eaten most of the suit. The chunks that were left were enough to act as clothes, but barely. Kyle felt satisfied. The hot dogs had nourished him greatly, functionally giving him more time in his day. Kyle grabbed the small key he kept in his desk. Kyle wanted to access the pantry, but found it was locked with a small keyhole. The pantry door lock creaked as if it hadn't moved for years, but eventually opened. Instead of an assortment of canned goods and grains, Kyle's pantry stored his massive amount of bottled lard. Kyle searched around the pantry for a selection of hot dogs. After a few minutes of searching, Kyle found several stashes of old hot dogs loose and in paper bags. He gathered them together and saw that he had a serviceable amount of hot dogs. Kyle walked over to the strange door in the hallway, but found quickly that the door was locked from the inside. With a hum and a pop, Kyle used his massive knowledge of hot dog magic to change the door handle into a hot dog. Kyle sucked the hot dog into his mouth, opened the door, and walked through. Kyle started looking around for anything he could use to make a hot dog stand. Kyle rooted around the scattered boxes and loose items. He picked up buckets, pieces of wood, rusty nails, and bits of string. Soon, he had enough loose items to be reasonably sure of being able to craft a stand that wouldn't fall over. Kyle made his way to the street corner. After a long day of preparation, Kyle felt very ready for his first outing as a hot dog salesman. Kyle started to unpack his things onto the corner of the street. Kyle took out his cart pieces and began to assemble them. With a little trouble, Kyle was able to finish constructing a serviceable hot dog stand. Kyle started to tear chunks out of the stand he had just constructed and shoved them into his mouth. Within moments, the stand had lost most of its structural stability and collapsed into a pile on the ground. Kyle did not stop. He took no enjoyment from eating his hot dog stand, but knew he must continue. A small crowd formed around Kyle. Kyle stopped eating. He slowly craned his neck to look at the people circled around him. Wordlessly, Kyle reached into his mouth and down his throat. Keeping eye contact with the crowd, he grabbed the topmost chunk of stand and drew it upwards. The atmosphere of wariness became potent. Kyle started to pull chunks out of his stomach very quickly. He threw them into a pile on the ground. As the crowd watched, terrified, Kyle began sticking the pieces of the stand together with his stomach juices. Soon, Kyle had recreated his hot dog stand. But Kyle realized that his stand was only step one. With an audience around him, he must start selling his hot dogs. Kyle skipped behind his new stand, took out several old hot dogs from his pack, and laid them on the table. Nobody moved. The hot dogs began spinning violently on the table and spitting flame. Kyle's stomach juices had acted as a catalyst to a festering chemical reaction inside of the food, making them unstable. One by one, the hot dogs started to balloon, doubling and tripling in size every second. Kyle tried to contain the hot dogs by smashing them with his fists. On contact, the hot dogs exploded with massive force, throwing the crowd backwards across the road. Dripping with hot dog pulp, Kyle made a realization about himself. For him, it wasn't about the hot dogs. It wasn't about the customers. It was about the adventure. Kyle left the ruins of his hot dog stand with a new purpose. He would follow the heart of adventure and not look back. The next day, Kyle embarked on a journey to the jungle to find a healthy amount of adventure. By the time he arrived, Kyle forgot why he had come. After a moment of milling, he decided to buy a return ticket home.